Hello, everyone, and thank you for being here. My name is Paul D'Ambrosio, and I teach Chinese philosophy at East China Normal University, where the 四海为学Collaborative Learning Project is based. I want to welcome you to our third event of 2025. Today, we have Professor Lydia Amir from Tufts University, Professor Hans-Georg Moeller from the University of Macau, and Professor John Lombardini from the College of William and Mary, here to engage in a roundtable on philosophical humor. Our chair today is Gina Lebkuecher from Wuhan University. It's become a tradition here at 四海为学to give younger scholars a chance to be part of high-profile academic events by inviting them to take part as chairs or discussants. So if there are any scholars who wish to be part of our events, please email me. This event will be 2 hours in total, ending promptly at 11 a.m. Beijing time. Before getting things started and handing them over to Dr. Gina, I want to say a few things about the 四海为学 Collaborative Learning Academic Forum. The 四海为学 Collaborative Learning Project hopes to distinguish itself from some of the less productive conventional practices in contemporary academia. As posted on our website, we are not interested in male peacocks, in jerks, or in any form of egoism or self-promotion. We hope to curb all types of aggressive and "look at me, I'm smarter than you," or "don't I know so much," and similar attitudes sometimes found in academic exchanges. We might even go so far as to say that we hope to be the counterbalance for the negative attitudes often found in blind reviews. While there's certainly a time and a place for anonymity, or at least the appearance of anonymity, communication in academia should have just as much time and place for speaking to one another in more congenial and community-forming settings. The neologism 四海为学, which was created by Robin Wong, is a play on 四海为家, and we hope to keep this idea at the foreground of all of our events. The 四海为学 Collaborative Learning Project seeks to accomplish these shifts in orientation during academic exchange by encouraging productive communication, humble discussions, real questions, and responses that are open and honest. We hope to foster environments where people truly learn from and with one another. Before introducing our chair, I want to once again thank Professors Lydia Amir, Hans-Georg Moeller, and John Lombardini for taking time and sharing with us today. Our chair is Dr. Gina Lebkuecher. She is an international research fellow in the School of Philosophy at Wuhan University. She earned her PhD from Loyola University, Chicago in 2024. And her research interests include ethics and classical Chinese philosophy. And her recent work is at the intersection of classical Confucian philosophy and contemporary ethical issues related to emerging technologies, marginalization, and oppression. We're very happy to have you here, Gina. The floor is yours.
Thanks, Paul, and thanks for inviting me to chair today. I'm really looking forward to the roundtable. So just to give a brief overview of today's format, each presenter will present for about 10 minutes, followed by up to 7 minutes of comments from each discussion. After all three presenters have shared their ideas and engaged with the discussants, we'll turn the remainder of the time over to open discussion. And as Paul mentioned, we'll aim to end right around 11 a.m. Beijing time, so about 2 hours from now. We'll start with Professor Amir's presentation, followed by discussion from Professor Mueller and Professor Lombardini. Then Professor Mueller will present, then Professor Lombardini will present. So I'll go ahead and briefly introduce Professor Amir, and then we'll have your comments. So Professor Lydia Amir teaches at the Philosophy Department at Tufts University, USA, and the Philosophy Graduate Studies program at West University of Timișoara, Romania. She's a research fellow at the Institute of Advanced Studies in Humanities and Social Sciences at Beijing Normal University at Zhuhai, and a board member of the International World Cultural Development Forum, China in the World. Amir is also founding president of the International Association of the Philosophy of Humor and founding editor of the Philosophy of Humor Yearbook and the DeGruyter series in philosophy and humor. In this field, apart from articles and essays, including an article comparing Chinese on a philosophic notion of humor, which she calls Homo Risibilis, the ridiculous human being, and works on two manuscripts that unfold its reach, The Incongruous Human Being for Palgrave Macmillan and What We Have in Common for Brill. Among additional areas of interest, Amir has founded book series in philosophical practice and transformative philosophy, the philosophy of the human condition, and modern philosophy. Besides her academic career, her work as a private philosophical practitioner has also been described in The New Yorker in December 2023. So let's welcome Professor Amir.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me well? Yes? Okay. So thank you for this long presentation. It's not about me. It's in order to let the participants know that there's no avenues for philosophy of humor. And apart from what Gina so kindly recited, apart from the Philosophy of Humor Yearbook, 300 pages each year, apart from the book series in the Greuter Philosophy of Humor, apart from the handbook that is forthcoming with 45 chapters and to which John Lombardini contributes. Apart from that, we also hold conferences which are quite friendly with time for discussion. We are present in all the APAs in America, and we have one annual conference, either in the United States or in Europe. The next one is in Krakow, in Poland, in July. And the International Association for the Philosophy of Humor, founded 10 years ago, really tries to bring philosophers from all walks and from East and West around this topic of humor as an umbrella term, which can be, of course, irony, tragedy and the comic, and wit, and anything that you may think of. I wanted to talk a little bit about all that because we are really interested in philosophers from Chinese philosophy and other Eastern traditions. I know of the work of most of the people present. Gina, I don't know of your work, but I know your university. And this is an extended invitation to be part of this community. It will be an honor if you would participate. Now, about the presentation, I didn't know what to do. You know, there are these books, there are these projects, you know, I can do many things. So let me say the following. John Moeller, I think you all know about him. He put the first agenda, but he was preoccupied with the nature of humor. Most researchers in humor, in philosophy, theory of humor are those in the past that did not intimate such a view. I think that what I ask humor is because then we try to read them back in history, which never goes well. It's not the same term, it's not the same culture.
Connection seems to be gone, at least for me.
Yes, I just lost her as well. Sorry, everyone. Okay. Seems
Oh, she's back.
Hi. Hi, Professor Amir. I think your connection may be a little bit unstable. Oh, you're muted.
Could you understand what I said till now? Until the break? Yes?
I think, no, okay. Maybe best to just start
Not
over.
understand.
Gina?
I could not understand. I'm sorry. Since I'm sorry for
wanted
interrupting,
to
but I'm supposed to comment, but I did not understand what Professor Amir said, except for her introduction about the Society for the Philosophy of Humor. But nothing after that, I couldn't understand anything.
Okay, let me try it without video, then maybe the connection will be all right. I'm just renting an apartment here, and I don't think that I have maybe the conditions. Is it all right? Is it better now? Can you hear me?
I can hear you better.
Okay. So I tried to say that the main question before I arrived on the scene and other people arrived was what the nature of humor is. And I wanted to switch the question into what is the role of humor in the good life? So those philosophers who actually argued for the role of humor as an umbrella term in the good life. It can be humor, it can be laughter, it can be irony, but I wanted argument, not style. Did anyone provide such argument? And I found in modern philosophy, 9 philosophers who did that. And then I tried to tell about the good life that they offered, find the main term of humor or laughter that they used. I was faithful to the terms that they preferred, and then find other terms that they used as well. Those 9 philosophers were actually, if we talk about humor, it was Shaftesbury, Hamann, Kierkegaard. If we talk about laughter, it's Montaigne, Nietzsche, Santayana. And then you have Nietzsche's laughter in France. Nietzsche was the philosopher of laughter in France. Laughter in Nietzsche's wake, Gilles Deleuze, Georges Bataille, and Clément Rosset. So this is one thing that I found of interest, to try to find arguments in favor of humor. This was actually disregarded in the past because philosophers are in a peculiar situation when it comes to humor. First, they have to give a definition, which is actually descriptive. So they describe the way humor or drama, comedy is performed or used in the society. And then there might be a negative tone, a criticism about that. But they always provide also a normative component in that. They always say, for example, if you take Plato, that true ridicule, true humor would be, for example, in being unaware of one's ignorance, yes, which will make most of Plato's comedies, most of Plato's dialogue into a comedy. So most researchers till now, what they did is that they looked either at the descriptive views of humor, and they said, well, this is not actually humor, this is a bad view of humor, or this is to say that humor is not good. They did not do the work of looking to the normative way, because the normative usually did not use the word humor or comical or something else. So you can find it in many, many philosophies. By doing that, you can look at philosophy's relationship with the comical. And they found out that in contradistinction to what is usually assumed, philosophy has very strong ties with the comic rather than with the tragic. Another point that I cannot develop now is that irony seems important in philosophy, but it's not. Most philosophers reject irony. But if you go with philosophy and the comic, and you go to the inception of philosophy, I find out 10 traditions that associate philosophy and the comic together since the beginning, and that you can follow till the 21st century. For example, you can look at the laughless Agelastos philosopher from Pythagoras on. You can look at the mocking sophist from the 5th century on. You can look even before the ridiculous philosopher, beginning with Thales in the 6th century before Christ. The laughing philosopher, beginning with Democritus in the 5th century. The comical philosopher, epitomized in Socrates, I think, the archetype of the teacher, the embodiment of philosophy, both a laughing and laughable person. Philosophy as comedic, as you can find in Plato and in the Cynics in the 5th century BC, as you find in Aristotle, as the mark of the human that mistakenly is attributed to Aristotle. And laughter is epistemologically valuable. You can find inklings of that in Plato, but this is something that has been developed in the 18th century by Shaftesbury and later on. And laughter is ontologically rooted. You can find it in Hegel, you can find it in Santayana and in Clément Rosset, in the English-speaking world and the French-speaking world, respectively. So if you trace these traditions from the inception to philosophy to today, you see that philosophy has a very, very tight connection with the comical. I cannot elaborate. So this was my opening possible discussion. I don't talk about my own thesis on Risibilus, the ridiculous human being, which is a take on Homo ridens, the laughing human being. Homo risibilus is a way in which I manage to solve many problems that otherwise remain unsolved. Humor can help us not only get to know oneself better, also deliberate better, live with conflict, but resolve conflict on a higher level according to one tool, philosophic view of what humor is that I develop, and I show that if we accept our ridicule, we can grace it and reach higher states of being, really joy, happiness, and a sense of eternity in living in the present. But this is another topic. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Professor Amir. Okay, next I'll invite Professor Moeller to offer his comments.
Thank you, Professor Amir, for sharing this overview of various, let's say, highlights in the philosophy of humor. First of all, I appreciate your work. I think it's important that someone is doing this and highlighting the role of humor throughout the history of philosophy. As you said, I mean, there was a little bit connection problems when you listed these 9 or 10 philosophers of humor, but I think all of those you mentioned were from the Western tradition, at least the names I understood, right? But I mean, they covered the period from the ancients to contemporary philosophers. But of course, as you said yourself earlier, I mean, it's a global thing, right? I mean, you could easily, I guess, extend the list with philosophers from all kinds of traditions. Then you mentioned different kind of approaches to humor. I very much agree with you that in addition to trying to understand what humor is, how it functions, it's also very central, maybe even more important, to find out what the role of humor is for a good life. Then you mentioned normative positions. I think that this is, and you didn't imply that. I'm not criticizing what you said, but I think we can distinguish between this aspect. What is the role of humor in good life? I would call it almost like a therapeutic approach in my terminology. What is kind of the therapeutic function of humor? And I think this can be distinguished from the normative attitudes towards humor that you also spoke of, because normative approaches to humor in philosophy sometimes, or perhaps even often, tend to somehow criticize humor as something bad. And I think that's also an important aspect. It's not an original claim. Many people mentioned that. That it's also interesting that in philosophy and also in religion, often there is like a negative normative kind of almost condemnation of humor. And this, of course, continues very much until today in the context of political correctness, like whatever recently in Germany, someone got really into trouble because of a humorous caricature of a leading politician that was not as fine, even though I thought it was exceedingly harmless. But in the current political climate, that is kind of a little bit inherited, I guess, from at least elements of the Christian tradition. That humor is regarded as something that must be kind of actively even persecuted and eradicated. That's also an important element in the history of humor that bears directly on the history of philosophy and the history of religion, and politically the kind of oppression of humor. That's also, I guess, an interesting theme. When it comes to philosophy, in addition to this history of the oppression of humor, there is also, maybe that's even more kind of prominent, something like a history of what I would call the sidelining of humor. That humor is somehow mentioned. I mean, particularly from the philosophy I work with, and Paul and I have worked with a lot, the philosophy of Zhuangzi, Taoist philosophy. A peculiar phenomenon is that basically almost everyone who writes about Zhuangzi and about Taoism mentions that it is a very humorous text. Very early on, this is very often mentioned, and then no one talks about it. It's like it bears has zero influence on the argumentation that is then on the interpretation. And that is, I think, something peculiar, but very not just with regard to Zhuangzi, that is found like throughout the philosophy of humor, that it is mentioned, yeah, this philosopher is humorous, and yeah, it's humor, but it doesn't really matter, right? It's something that is, yeah, it's nice. It's makes it kind of more appealing to the audience, but doesn't really have anything to do with the interpretation. It can be almost as soon as it was mentioned, it can be forgotten. So I think this sidelining of humor in the history of philosophy is also like an interesting, let's say, hermeneutic phenomenon. A the hermeneutic activity tends to sideline humor. That I think is in perhaps even more, arguably even more prominent than the condemnation or suppression of humor for various reasons. Maybe I leave it at this. I don't know exactly how long I talk, but I guess I'm pretty much did my task, hopefully.
Yes, that was great. Thank you, Professor Mueller. Professor Amir, would you like to respond?
When I talked about the normative side of philosophers, it has been often overlooked that they point to a way that they could endorse a kind of humor or laughter that did not exist in their society. For example, Plato says that people laugh at the philosopher, and they may even kill him if they can. He say it, I think, in the Republic. But then he said that true ridicule is in not knowing oneself. That means that his entire dialogues become comedies. for example, Shaftesbury in the 18th century is yearning to a laughter that does not even deserve that name because it's before the English concept of humor, but is pointing to that. And I have many examples of this sort. And those who look into philosophy often miss. For example, Aristotle may talk about the mask of the comedy in his time, do his job as a scientist of comedies and tragedies, but then he would call wit or trapelia a virtue, a social virtue. Okay, so there's a lot of work to be done. Unfortunately, usually it's not in the indexes. You have really to read the text and see that. The important role that philosophers gave to humor when you look for the arguments and not for the style is an epistemological role. This is what I wanted to show, how humor is useful to get to the truth. Also in Kierkegaard, this is very shocking to theologians. But for Kierkegaard, if you examine your laughter, your spontaneous laughter, you can see what you have overcome. And you have an idea where you are on the stages of one's life, for example. The idea that humor or ridicule can be a test of truth is from Shaftesbury, with great influence for 200 years after Shaftesbury. There has been a wonderful and terrible discussion about, do we have a sense of ridicule, yes or no? And then can we discern truth through that, or would truth collapse under ridicule? You find in Hamann the idea that truth can show you the humor can show you the truth of reality, but Hamann is deeply religious. So he thinks that the contradiction in Christ being in God in the human being actually makes you understand that reality is like a joke. If you get it, you get actually the work, etc. So that's very interesting when you follow the arguments and you take humor seriously, not just as a stylistic, as you say, in Zhuangzi also as something, we know that there's humor, but don't take seriously the epistemology of that, the truth power of that, then you miss a lot. Of course, humor is also used in philosophy in exoteric writings. When you want to address other public and you want to make the change of value that philosophy advances more palatable, you use humor in order to pierce the defenses that the person has. And you have many philosophers, not everyone knows that Kant was a great admirer of humor, of laughter in the body. So I wanted just to say that the normative can be in philosophy also something that is sometimes. You are right that Christianity was against laughter. That was very interesting. And there's a lot to continue talking about that. This is a very view of humor, but a view of philosophy.
Great, thank you. I'll now invite Professor Lombardini to provide his comments.
Thanks, Gina, and thank you, Lydia. It's a pleasure to finally see you virtually, at least, after working together on the handbook of humor. Yeah, thank you very much for your presentation, which I thought was really thought-provoking, and I'm excited to see the project in its full development. I just wanted to kind of maybe comment on a couple of things that really invite you to maybe elaborate on a couple of things that I found particularly thought-provoking. And one was that kind of you mentioned that philosophy, that in your view, philosophy is has its closest affinity with the comic, versus those who would argue that perhaps it has its closest affinity with the tragic or even the ironic. And I was just wondering, one thing I was would prompt you to I'd like to hear a little bit more about is the kind of the comic versus the ironic in terms of the affinity with philosophy. Because I'm thinking of something like Jonathan Lear's Case for Irony. There's also a French article, I forget, it's been a while since I read it, but it's like Thales or Socrates. And it's like the Socrates is the true beginning of philosophy because he introduces irony into philosophy. So I'm just interested to kind of hear why you think that the comic has this kind of closer affinity than the ironic in a certain way. And I was wondering, and the second kind of point that I would love to hear a little bit more about is when you were talking right then in response to Professor Moeller about the connection between humor and comedy and the good life. A lot of the responses that you brought in there connected directly to a kind of how comedy or humor leads us to the truth. Kind of, and then how, I guess, like attaining the truth or leading us towards the truth is a component of the good life. I'm thinking of other aspects where like that comedy as a kind of, or humor as a social virtue, right? That also can connect us or kind of be a constituent part of the good life. I'm thinking of something like Aristotle and the virtue of wittiness or eutrapelia, which is kind of like one of the social virtues, right? Of course, as you know, in the Nicomachean Ethics, which has more to do with kind of how we joke and laugh with each other, right? At least in that particular context in the text, right? Rather than with kind of how it leads us to maybe the kind of truth capital T. And so I was wondering if you had also kind of thought about in your project kind of the way in which, right, humor either facilitates or constitutes part of our kind of social interactions, and those social interactions or kind of friendship, things like that, also indirectly constitute part of the good life, right? If part of our ability to laugh with others, right, is also part of what makes humor part of the good life.
Mm-hmm.
Great,
Okay,
thank you.
thank you for, yes. Sorry.
No, you're fine. Please go ahead, Professor Amir. But I might suggest, if you don't mind, turning off your video again, just to make sure that there's no.
But do you want me to respond now, or do you want someone else?
Yes, please go ahead.
Okay. I got accustomed to looking at myself when I talk, so I don't know how I can do it without that. So listen, I emphasize the relationship of philosophy with the comic rather than with the tragic. If you remember, philosophy from a certain point on was created in order to counter the tragic view of life that you could find in Greek tragedies. We tend to forget that. Philosophy is a kind of gospel, good news, yes. First, in that sense, it's countering the tragic in a way that modern contemporary French philosophers of the tragic, like Clément Rosset, says that you can find no tragic in philosophy. It's a big no. Either then it's not tragic or it's not called a philosophy if you have this kind of thinkers. So the comic is actually much more emphasized than has been ever studied because it was not considered serious enough, or it was considered only a question of style or whatever. This made, I think, Kierkegaard mad. He said they can combine everything, but they cannot combine seriousness and irony. I don't understand that. They wanted either seriousness or irony. Now about irony. Listen, in the handbook in which we both contributed, I was surprised to find out that contrary to what we think that philosophers embrace irony. And we have a problem of terminology, because in Italy, for example, irony means another thing that in English, let's say. And you know yourself that the Platonic, the Socratic Plato is ironic, but in Xenophon is joking. For Karl Popper is humorous, you know? Okay. So I found out, looking at the evidence, that there is no one school of philosophy which endorses irony, even since the beginning. You know, the Epicurean reject that, the Stoics that follow the Socrates, you would imagine that they would embrace that. No manly person would be ironic. The Middle Platonists already disregard that. Aristotle rejected irony and his followers as well. in the Middle Ages, you can find irony only as a rhetorical device, but ethically it was a problem. And I can follow like that in modern philosophers. They didn't like irony because it was a rhetorical device. And when you continue, even Hegel rejected irony, criticized romantic irony. Romantic philosophers did not want to call it irony, but rather humor. Postmodern philosophers all rejected irony. Deleuze chose systematically humor over irony. And nobody knows all this information, and everybody thinks that philosophers endorse irony. Show me one. There's Rorty, but his view of irony has nothing to do with our view of irony connected with the comical. It's a new definition. And the Romantics who endorsed irony, but actually there were poets, there were people dealing with literature. It has not much to do with philosophy. When we talk about philosophers, you couldn't find one. You know, in Plato, you don't have an argument in defense of irony. You don't have one who endorses irony. I couldn't find. So this is quite amazing. This is why I had to explain that. So I thought that because aesthetics was created in the 18th century, and because it was, 19th century romantic irony, so it's considered an aesthetic term. So people talk about irony as if it's a good thing, but you cannot find even one person. Of course, there are poets in romantic irony, which is another sense, the classical irony, and Rorty another sense. And this is something, to be investigated. What do we mean by saying that philosophers like irony? So self-referential humor in Italy is called irony, but it's self-referential humor. I don't think it's irony, because to have self-referential humor, we need a kind of compassion that you don't find in irony. So about philosophers and that, I think that philosophers, you say we laugh at each other, etc. But the philosophers, they have one thing that has been singled out by many philosophers. They can laugh at themselves if they do it right, if they follow the laughter at others and then understand that the others are themselves, yes, and then they laugh at themselves. This is what Montaigne indicates. This is the change from homo ridens to homo visibilis, yes. He laughs at himself. And in a way, there have been some contemporary thinkers that defined the philosophic act as the capacity to divide into one part laughing at the other. So self-referential humor or laughter would be the mark of the philosopher, which is quite interesting, because a contemporary philosopher and a colleague of mine, Daniel Dennett, just died, and he wrote a book on jokes, reverse engineering the mind, in which he says that actually jokes or humor comes from the first person. It's an evolutionary device in us to correct mistakes. That would make me understand why the philosopher is supposed to laugh at himself, because he's the one who's supposed to correct most his mistakes, instead of laughing at the mistakes of others. And many people forget that Democritus, he was laughing at everyone, the Democritus from the Hippocrates letters. But not many people notice that he says, I am laughing because you people laugh at others instead of at yourself. So this self-referential humor or laughter, which I do not call irony, is actually essential for understanding the kind of self-education that humor, when internalized, can create. Because the philosopher divides himself in two. In one part that criticizes lovingly, compassionately, the other. This is how we advance towards the ideal. So self-referential laughter is very potent in philosophy as an educational tool for oneself. Philosophy is mainly self-education. So the truth, in humor, laughter can serve many, many things, ethical, political, etc. But it can also advance towards the truth in Shaftesbury, in many other things, because how can I say, when you have to fashion your character, if you don't use humor, you cannot fashion it in a way that's very mathematical. You need some kind of play, of game that just we call a humor. I can talk about it for hours. I think there is a new model of rationality that we have as philosophers because we cannot handle contradictions with reason. And there are contradictions in our lives, necessarily one. We need a new tool that can handle the contradiction without collapsing them and without dying from the tension of the contradiction. This is the philosophic tool of humor, which I am advancing.
Great, thank you, Professor Amir. I think let's go ahead and welcome Professor Moeller to give his presentation. So Hans-Georg Moeller is a professor in the Department of Philosophy and Religious Studies at the University of Macau. He's authored numerous books, including Profile Yourself, Identity After Authenticity, Genuine Pretending on the Philosophy of the Zhuangzi, both with Paul D'Ambrosio, The Moral Fool, A Case for Amorality, The Radical Lumen, and The Philosophy of the Tao Te Ching, all with Columbia University Press. And he's a content creator of the YouTube philosophy channels Carefree Wandering and Philosophy in Motion. So let's welcome Professor Moeller.
Thank you, Gina. I'm going to share a PowerPoint, if I may. It's a very short PowerPoint. Can you see it?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes, okay. Just 3 slides, basically. Professor Amir was already talking about the attempts to define humor and to explain how it works. I mean, everyone laughs frequently, but we don't really know why. It's an interesting phenomenon. And as probably many of you will know, there are 3 there are more, but three of the major humor theories are the superiority theory. Professor basically it in what she just said, that is like a traditional idea that we laugh at the mistakes of others. So whatever you see, like in a cartoon, and someone is doing something silly or whatever, is falling and stuff like this, and then the idea is that laughing comes from a kind of sense of superiority. That's a traditional European theory of humor. Then the relief theory is more associated with people like Freud. But of course, that's also that humor is like, and laughter is an expression of relief. For instance, that jokes and so forth, that they somehow provide a relief of tension. And then a third, and I understand still perhaps most prominent theory, I'm not 100% sure though, but is the theory of incongruity, that humor and laughter, humor works with and laughter is kind of provoked or produced by the perception of something that is incongruous, something that just doesn't match. I guess these two, particularly the two final theories, relief and incongruity, they match quite well. And they also correspond, I guess, to a relatively famous definition of what laughter is, and thereby humor, in Kant's Critique of Judgment, that laughter is an affection arising from the sudden transformation of a strained expectation, gespannte Erwartung, into nothing. And I guess this combines the relief and incongruity, this definition on the one hand, because we have this the gespannte Erwartung, the strained expectation that is somehow is the tension is relieved. So it's a laughter is kind of a dissolution of tension. But then there's, of course, also the incongruity element, because we have this strained expectation, which makes us expect something very serious. And that is then suddenly transformed into nothing. So we have this incongruity between something that is serious and that is not. And so I think that combines the relief and the incongruity theory. And I'm personally a fan of this combination of relief and incongruity theory. But then if that is the case, we might ask relief from what? And I like to point in this regard to the Russian scholar of literature, famous Mikhail Bakhtin, who coined this notion of the carnivalesque. And of course, carnivalesque is, he traced it particularly in the works of Dostoevsky and Rabelais, also having a lot to do with incongruity. Right, the carnival reverses the roles of high and low, and that which was respected and that which is disrespected. This is all reversed, and so the carnivalesque is also very much a theory of incongruity. And of course, you can see this in many different variations. So the carnivalesque is a very broad notion, not only including traditional carnival in European traditions from ancient Greece to contemporary carnival traditions, including in Germany, but also broader, like you can extend it to stand-up comedy, which is very popular still today. And I think in all of these forms of the carnivalesque, Bakhtin is right to point to to one aspect, namely that they often, not always, but often provide this relief from moral fear. Right, that we normally in society we have strong normative moral pressures, and that as a social practice, and also Professor Lombardini was mentioning this very important aspect, right? That it is, of course, carnival is also a social practice. You don't do this alone, and even stand-up comedy, right? I mean, they usually show the audience along with it if you watch it, and so even this is kind of a communal experience. So it's a kind of the community that kind of relieves itself from its moral fear, because particularly when you're in a community, there is strong moral pressure. You have to behave according to norms. And so it's a kind of community practice in which the community somehow provides itself relief from the moral fear it itself imposes on itself. So I think that is a good definition by Bakhtin, that it is a kind of a social practice of, again, incongruously relieving the moral pressure the community by definition must impose on itself. Again, whatever Freud's discontent of civilization, right? When we're together as a group, in order to function, on the one hand, we must impose, discipline on ourselves. But in order to make this discipline that we impose on ourselves bearable, we also have a practice of laughter and humor that allows us to live with the discipline we impose on ourselves. And so that brings me back to this notion of the therapeutic function that I would ascribe to humor, which is, I guess, very prominently described in Taoism and Zen Buddhism. That's what I said earlier. For instance, with regard to Zhuangzi, that many philosophical interpretations note the humor because it's so obvious, but then they often disregard the therapeutic function and still tend to read the philosophy mostly as normative, especially today, right? Because moral philosophy is such a dominant field in contemporary philosophy. So many philosophers find themselves kind of mode of detecting certain kind of moral philosophies, and and I think that misses a central point, which I guess we see also in Taoism and in Zen Buddhism. I think they function in line with what I just said about Bakhtin, that they are also kind of therapeutic philosophical practices, to go back to what Professor Amir said about the good life, to kind of help provide us relief from moral fear. And I think Taoism and Zen Buddhism have this as an important element, at least within them, that they are these therapeutic cures for moral fear. So in this sense, I think they, especially Taoism, kind of strengthen, as I like to say, a mental and emotional immune system that fosters sanity, that makes us immune again against the pressures of the, in particular, moral and normative regimes we impose on ourselves inevitably. Right, but just as whatever we have bodily, again, using this as a metaphor, we are inevitably exposed to all kinds of potentially sickening things, and we need to build at the same time some form of immunity, build up certain immunity against it. And I think that again is the function of humor, if you want, is kind of building up this immunity system that allows us to withstand these pressures. And again, as I said, not just individually, but very importantly, collectively. Now then, the second aspect, and that's the final slide, I guess, yes, the incongruity of what, after the relief of what. Like this practice of ambiguation, and philosophically, I like to call it the transformation of necessity into contingency. Again, think, for instance, of norms. We see alternatives. We see that not just one set of norms is imaginable, but that also, let's say, the opposite of set of norms is also imaginable. So we see alternatives, and we see the contingency of our life circumstances. And I guess this is like again, it combines relief and incongruity. We see that that which seems to be without alternative is not without alternative, and that provides relief by making the ambiguity visible. And then thereby, that's basically the same thing put in different words, a deconstruction of dogmatic thinking and of reductions to root cause, right? So that it also kind of subverts dogmatic thinking, and in this sense leads to something like a liberatory indeterminacy. All right, that's it. I stop sharing.
Great, thank you, Professor Moeller. So next I'll invite Professor Amir and then Professor Lombardini to offer your comments up to about 7 minutes each. Thanks.
Professor Moeller, I have no special comments. I think it was a brilliant presentation. I love the idea of, I don't know if you used the sacrifice or if you used any religious term. Georges Bataille, I'm not a fan of contemporary French philosophy, but what can I do? They developed theories of humor, the comic and the tragic and laughter, so I had to go there. Georges Bataille thinks that what happens when there is stand-up comedy, that someone is actually put to death. I think it's a religious ritual. We use the term, you kill me, yes. We use the term roasting someone. And he really thinks that we have a kind of collective guilt, that no religion can actually help us because it's collective, and that actually we need to execute. Through laughter, we do it symbolically. It's a sham comedy in which someone is put to death. And he was actually offering a kind of mysticism of laughter, in which by laughing at yourself, not only physically, not a yoga or laughter, but really the act of self intellectually, it's a glory and a collapse at the same time. And he said that the mistake of religions was that they tried to save us, and instead of being saved because it's impossible, we should really aim at our own destruction. So laughing at oneself would be a kind of self-destruction, but still staying alive. So I wanted to add that to these very thorough comments about Bakhtin. It's a little bit edgy, this Bataille, but he has interesting things because it says that we are laughing at our own insufficiency. Yes, that the collapse is part of life, the failure in life, and still staying alive. Yes, and it's related to anxiety, as you said. You talked about something like that, or moral anxiety. Yes, you said moral anxiety or moral sin. So it refers to this kind of thing, the relationship of laughter with anxiety. He was suffering acute anxiety, and it's almost very hard to understand what he's talking about. Till Roland Barthes, who read him, said, until I understood that it describes fear, I could not understand what he was saying. But he developed this kind of practice for his fear through laughter, meditation of laughter. And he actually studied Zen and other things and Chinese tradition. He was ahead on this time in this way. But it's so weird because it's a mysticism of laughter in a way that was never offered. He actually said that through laughter, which ontologically opened the ground of things, he got the same experience that he could have with Christianity, which is very shocking. He had a return to Catholicism and then he left, yes, and then through laughter, he reached a mystical union with the unknown. It's a kind of atheology. Well, these were my thoughts when we were talking very interestingly about this moral sin and relief. It tries to explain relief from what.
Great. Thank you, Professor Amir. Professor Moeller, would you like to respond?
Yes, thank you very much, also, Professor Amir. Yes, I really think the comments your comments are very much to the point, bringing in Bataille and sacrifice and this notion of collapse. I mean, that resonates strongly, I guess, also with Kant's definition that I was referring to. So we have something that is of utmost seriousness, and this then collapses. That's of course related to the act of sacrifice, and I guess and that it's almost a kind of a self-deconstructing religious act in that which we are normally, or which we are imposed. Again, we have this practice of taking something with utmost seriousity, and this then collapses, right? Again, the strained expectation collapses into nothing. That has a kind of, as you, I guess, at the end of your comment, you also mentioned this kind of cathartic function, right? Again, it's a function of relief. And I guess we have, on the one hand, this is like this kind of religious self-ironic in the sense of which you mentioned earlier, irony as self-irony. But we have kind of in the form of the sacrifice, and it's interesting that you mentioned this with regard to the stand-up comedian. We have kind of a performative theatrical collapse, a self-irony, and then but if we look at it from the Bataille perspective, it's a collapse of the idol, a collapse of the religious figure that we normally are in awe of, and that then collapses. And this can also, of course, be related directly to the self, right? That humor, we not just practice the collapse of the idol as that which we take most seriously, the collapse of the religious symbol that we worship. But of course, we are also the other thing, other than the external religious idol that we worship, we also are very much seriously committed to establishing our identity, our selfhood. And self-irony then provides us again with a momentary, at least, relief from taking ourselves seriously. So it's not this external idol that collapses, but the internal idol that we worship and that we are kind of dedicated to maintain and to present our own identity. So in a sense, I guess we have we can understand the practice of humor as a kind of a momentary collapsing of both the external idol, which we treat normally with utmost seriousness, namely the religious idol, and then the internal idol, the self-identity that we're also, strenuously dedicated to somehow worshipping, but then humor allows us to have this collapsing. And in both cases, this is done like in a collective way, right? Both the religious act of the sacrificing of the idol, as well as our kind of public, because this self-irony is also always public, right? That we kind of that we do not insist on maintaining our presenting our coherent identity, but allow it to collapse in front of others. Okay, that's just some thoughts. Some thoughts in reaction to what you said.
Great, thank you. Now I'll invite Dr. Lombardini to give his comments.
Thanks, Gina. Thank you, Professor Moeller. I was really I've too many things to say, but I can limit myself to three, just kind of comments and questions to keep the conversation going. So one, when in response to Professor Amir's presentation, you mentioned this idea about the oppression of humor, or this idea of kind of like trying to oppress humor, try to sideline, right? Well, sidelining it being a slightly different thing. And I was wondering, going back to your first slide, if you thought, and this is my intuition, but that it's often when kind of humor is normatively denigrated, right, in that way, people are mostly conflating all forms of humor with some form of superiority, right? And what's kind of morally problematic about humor is the superiority that one asserts over the other, right? And so again, I guess the kind of question here, is there a relationship there between this kind of impetus to try to oppress humor or kind of stamp humor out, and this thinking about humor as falling into that category of superiority? The second kind of got to the language, came to me from the language of therapeutic that you used. And I was wondering if by therapeutic, this anticipates a little bit what I'm going to talk about in my presentation, but I wonder if by therapeutic, you would also fold into that something like pedagogical forms of humor, which certainly seem to be an example, certainly that you gave of like Taoism or Zen Buddhism, right? Certainly this kind of like, not just unblocking our own kind of mental blocks, but also recognizing the kinds of mental blocks that our students, right, might have and might need to overcome, and the way in which just kind of communicating directly with them, right, might not be sufficient to get them to kind of achieve the kind of understanding or spiritual awakening that they need to achieve. And so the kind of part of the kind of aspect, like, the master or either teacher can use humor pedagogically, but for that kind of therapeutic purpose, right? Kind of unblock the student. And then the last point came out of what you were talking about with ambiguity and incongruity of what. And I really like the point that you were making about the kind of recognition of contingency that incongruity theories of laughter point us towards. It always makes me think here, and this is kind of the comment of Bergson's essay on laughter, right, where he talks about laughter coming out of this kind of imposition of something mechanical upon something living, right? Which seems to kind of connect back to the point that you were just making before about the kind of the way in which we become blocked, or we become blind to the ways that we are kind of either to the possibility of transformation, or maybe to bring it back to the kind of Taoist point or Zhuangzi, right, that we are always in the process of transformation, right? And what kind of makes the kind of, right, that Bergson's intuition there kind of maps onto that in the way there's something comical about us trying to arrest that natural process of transformation that we can't, of course, arrest, right? We might want to or wish to, right? But of course, it's impossible for us as human beings to do that. I'll leave it there.
Thanks a lot for these comments. With points 2 and 3, I haven't really thought about it in that way as you put it, but immediately it seems completely convincing, both points to me. Both the last point, which is very interesting about this kind of the Zhuangzi Taoist point about the affirmation and acceptance of transformation and thereby of incongruity. That seems immediately to me like an excellent point. And also, of course, the second point about humor as a very important pedagogical tool. And I do think that's definitely the case, especially in Taoism and in Buddhism, we have this pedagogical, didactical of humor of the master, and of course this is like this again, like this connects with what some of the things I said earlier. It's especially clear in Taoism, in Zen Buddhism, but I guess also in Taoism, the self-performative self-deconstruction of the master, right? The master understands that that particularly the master-student relation is kind of a performative contradiction to achieving the pedagogical goal. And that therefore this kind of performative self-deconstruction is constantly needed, that the master kind of performatively deconstructs his or her role as the master. That's I think also a very well taken point. The first thing you mentioned, you were talking about, is traditionally the superiority theory of humor, that this was used to kind of normatively dismiss humor as something morally bad, and that is definitely still the case today. But I don't believe that. I mean, I think it's on the one hand, it's true what you're saying, that this superiority theory is used to dismiss humor. But I think it's actually not the case that humor works on the basis of superiority. What actually humor does much more than, asserting some form of superiority is it questions the superiority of those who are in power. And religious powers nowadays, political powers, or whatever powerful normative dogmas or practices in society. And so we see a strong reaction against that, whatever. Like in Islam, you're not supposed to make cartoons of Muhammad, but now we have all this political correctness and so forth. And we have, I guess, in a way, Western culture has become more fundamentalist than many fundamentalist religious cultures, particularly, and they have become new kind of power systems. And you can see how somehow there's almost a correlation. The more repressive a culture becomes, the more the more it tries to systematically dismiss and not allow certain forms of humor, always accusing this humor of asserting some superiority, whereas in fact I think humor is always just trying to subvert the existing power structures. That would be my point, my reaction to the first point you made. But thank you very much for the comments.
Great. Thank you, Professor Mueller. Okay, now we'll invite our last presenter, Professor Lombardini. Professor Lombardini is Associate Professor of Government and International Relations and Affiliate Faculty in Classical Studies at William & Mary. He received his BA in Political Science from Rutgers University, his PhD in Politics from Princeton University, and was a postdoctoral fellow at the Society of Fellows at Columbia University. Professor Lombardini has published books on Socrates and Plato, alongside articles on topics related to ancient democracy and humor. His current project focuses on a comparison of the demos and guoren in archaic Greece and spring and autumn period China. Thanks, Professor Lombardini. Let's welcome him to present now.
I'm just going to share a couple of slides as well. Okay. I'm screen sharing. I am sharing the wrong screen. Now I'm sharing the right screen. I see by Gina's nod. Okay, good. All right, thank you. Sorry about that. Yeah, so what I was thinking about the kind of question of philosophical humor, right? The questions that arose for me was kind of some of the same ones that arose for Professor Moeller and Amir, right? What does humor do for philosophy, right? And also just kind of what makes humor philosophical. And in thinking about these questions, right, brings me back to kind of some of my earlier work on Socrates and the kind of ethical and political debates around Socratic humor, right? And so one of the things that I kind of want to argue here, just kind of mention here, is that I think that in the beginning of the Greek philosophical tradition, right, as Professor Amir is well aware and as already mentioned, right, these questions about the kind of ethical, right, dimensions of humor are there from the start. And arguably many of them kind of some of the first real debates about the kind of ethical dimensions of humor, right, center around the figure of Socrates, where even if we associate Socrates with irony and the irony of the Platonic dialogues, right? It's often been argued that, well, Socrates isn't really ironic in Aristophanes, and even if he is ironic in Xenophon, it's kind of a pale imitation of what we see in Plato, right? When we think about not just irony, but a whole kind of range of what we may call humor or scholastic practices, then we see a lot of Socratic humor in all of our depictions of Socrates that go beyond what we might strictly think about as irony in Plato, right? And so I think that, right, one of the kind of earliest conversations that we get around humor around Socrates revolves around a kind of response to the depiction of Socrates that we get in Aristophanes' Clouds. And there, right, they're kind of very famous, as this kind of image suggests, right, we got Socrates in the basket, head up in the clouds, right? He's this bumbling fool, right? He's a comic figure in Aristophanes, right? Whose philosophy is both dangerous, but also somehow useless at the same time, right? But one of the things that we see Socrates doing throughout this play is really kind of mercilessly mocking, right, those who are his intellectual inferiors, right? And very famously, he does this to the man Strepsiades, who comes to learn at his thinkery in order to learn the weaker argument so he can avoid paying his debts, right? But what this figure learns from Socrates, right, is not the abstract philosophical concepts that Socrates tries to teach, but he learns to mock his perceived intellectual inferiors and use that kind of mockery, right, to deny that he should be accountable to them in any way, right? The way Socratic mockery is kind of figured in Aristophanes' Clouds is as a kind of danger, a dangerous practice by intellectuals that seeks to kind of subvert, right, the wisdom of the crowd, the wisdom of the demos, and their ability to make collective decisions, right? So one of the things I think that we can see in the kind of earliest responses to Aristophanes' depiction of Socrates in Plato and, right, Xenophon is not, of course, only the idea that, well, Aristophanes got Socrates wrong, he wasn't really a sophist, but also a debate about the nature of Socratic humor, right? With both Plato and Xenophon insisting that either, right, Socrates' humor wasn't just this kind of superiority and mocking that we might, right, berate someone for, but actually is more this kind of ironic self-referential humor, which serves a fundamental pedagogical purpose, right? And also we see in Xenophon, even when, right, Socrates sought to mock his interlocutors, that mockery still served an important philosophical function, right? So in Plato, of course, we get, right, this very, not only do we get this distinction between Socrates and the sophist, right, but also this distinction maps onto different kind of practices of humor, right? In a dialogue like the Euthydemus, right, the two sophistical figures there, right, once they kind of catch someone up in a contradiction, not only did they laugh at the bumbling fool who gets it wrong, but all of their fellow students laugh. Right? It's this kind of performance of mocking someone for their intellectual inferiority, right? Very notably in Plato's dialogue, Socrates never laughs. While he laughs twice in the Phaedo, both are kind of understated forms of laughter. But what we get is this kind of self-referential, right, humor in the form of irony, which again, right, arguably serves a kind of pedagogical purpose, right? It draws in one's interlocutors, right? It allows them, right, especially if they are, sorry, I don't know what's going on with my desktop there. Sorry. It allows them to kind of, right, if they are, right, unaware, right, or worried about engaging in that kind of philosophical questioning, right, that Socrates might subject them to, right, this kind of self-referential humor, right, can help to assuage that concern, right? And in Xenophon, again, I depicted Xenophon as a snail here because very famously, Bertrand Russell thought he was too dumb to understand Socrates, to which I believe Vlastos quipped, "If I were to be stranded in Persia with 300 of my fellow Greeks, I would much rather have had Xenophon in command than Bertrand Russell." So Xenophon is not the slow-witted snail, but right, he doesn't really, when he does depict Socrates as ironic, right, the problem is that Xenophon kind of lets us in on the joke. He's like, so Socrates said this, but what he really meant was blah, 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 right? So it's almost a kind of function of the narrative device that Xenophon lets us in on the joke. So the humor, the irony of Socrates that we see in Plato doesn't carry with it quite that deep ambiguity and puzzlement, right, which seems to be more profoundly philosophical. But we do see Xenophon directly mock his interlocutors, right, in order precisely to shame them, right, in order to get them to realize that they don't know what they think they know, right, and that kind of moment of kind of recognition through shame, Xenophon Socrates seems to think is crucial, right, for people to kind of take that next step and actually learn. Right. Right. It's impossible for Socrates' interlocutors to learn anything if they already think they know everything. Right. So again, right, I think that what we get in these kind of early depictions of Socrates is not only a response to the idea that Socrates is a sophist, but also the kind of creation, a kind of reflection on the ethical and political dimensions of humor that's trying to explain why it is that what Socrates was doing with humor, right, wasn't just kind of mocking his opponents for the sake of mocking his opponents, right, but was directly kind of crafted towards this specific pedagogical purpose, right? And I think as Professor Amir suggested with the Stoics and other later Greek thinkers, I think this legacy of kind of thinking about what Socrates was doing with humor, what Socrates was doing with irony, kind of continued, right? Well past the classical period, right? And so I think I had some concluding questions, and I think that one of them we've already kind of talked, and I think the answer is already no, right? But I often think about this kind of question, and must humor serve a pedagogical purpose to be philosophical, right? Because one of the things that we do see, right, in a lot of kind of ancient scholarship on ancient philosophy and kind of thinking, and I think this gets back to Professor Moeller's point about sidelining humor in discussions of philosophy, is it often can be seen as kind of window dressing or a side topic, right, that a philosophical thinker took up, but not kind of in some ways centrally, it's not actually kind of philosophical, or it's not central, right, to their kind of either philosophical vision or philosophical purpose, right? And so maybe it's not a pedagogical purpose to be philosophical, but is the kind of question of like, what is it that truly kind of makes humor fully philosophical, right? And the other question, given that we've kind of moved across a lot of contexts and a kind of both historically and culturally, is the question that I think a lot about is kind of like, how do we identify, right, humor when we're moving transhistorically and we're moving cross-culturally, right? We can think about this in different ways, right? Do we know what and why people found certain things funny in different times and places, right? We can ask this in terms of, right, questions of, right, cross-cultural understanding. We can also, right, ask this in terms of questions of, right, the specific language of humor, right, in different cultures in different places. I think Christoph Harbsmeyer, in a couple of pieces on irony and humor in early Chinese philosophy in the Analects, right, noted that I think Jeffrey Henderson in his book, The Immaculate Muse, noted that there are like something like 200 different classical Greek words for genitalia. And unfortunately, classical Chinese is just too lacking in characters for genitalia to really develop a kind of robust discourse on humor, right? Obviously, he was jesting there, right? But it does raise those questions about kind of in what ways, right, can we discern a kind of irony in the Analects if we don't have, right, a kind of clear, right, terminological identification, right, of that kind of practice, right? So I'll just leave it there. Thank you.
Great, thank you,
Stop
Professor
sharing.
Lombardini.
Yeah.
Thank you. Okay, so now I'll invite Professor Amir and then Professor Moeller to give your comments.
Thank you, John, for this question. What makes humor philosophical? I have two thoughts about that. One, humor is an ambiguous tool to target ambivalence. And it's related to truth much more complicatedly than I've presented before. Its target is really illusion, necessary illusions. We can have glimpses of truth only for moments. We need the illusion. Humor knows that. Humor manages to say the truth and the untruth at the same time. We get it momentarily. We appreciate this unveiling of truth and the fact that whatever humor says or the person who uses humor understand that we need the illusion. So this is deep in the human condition. This may explain why humor is considered a mark of the human. This is one thing. The other, if you talk about Aristotle, you have the mean, you have two extremes. Then you take on the characters of Terence and later comedy. What humor enables us is simultaneously to grasp the two extremes, and by grasping that, finding momentarily the truth, the human truth, which would be a kind of middle that you cannot affix eternally or even for a while. You have to find it again and again, only to lose it. So in that sense, humor is indicative of human truth. And for us philosophers, we can write books, we can be as clear as Kant, but, you would appreciate laughter as well. When it comes to truth in human terms, we need humor in ways that were not enough formulated to this day. How humor helps us. Without that, this is why Nietzsche would say, I would not believe in truth in which would not come with a kind of laughter. We have to explain these things. It's deeply related to our human condition. So for me, humor is the back door to the human condition. It's a kind of polite way of addressing the most important aspect of the human condition. And indeed, if we were to understand fully what humor is, we will understand better the human being. Our necessary ambivalence, the ambiguity, necessary illusion that historically for Montaigne and Bergson, humor targets illusion in that way. But because it's humor, it's and both. It's not either truth or falsehood. Yes, it's true and not true at the same time. And we appreciate that because this is our reality.
Okay, thank you, Professor Amir. Professor Lombardini, would you like to respond?
Thank you for that, Lydia. That was excellent. I'm not I'm not sure I can follow that up. But yeah. So this is really just a kind of, it brings back to the kind of superiority theory and what I said before, and a little bit about kind of, I guess, the oppression of humor, or kind of, the kind of mockery in Aristophanes or something like that. But what this is more of a kind of just devil's advocate. Like, I guess I'm always thinking is like, there is a kind of unveiling, right, of truth that can come through humor. But for those who would want to take the more negative view, right, they might argue that, right, many examples of laughter or humor actually emanate from either self-delusion, right? And then we can say, okay, the person who laughs is themselves deluded, and so they become a comic figure, right, for us, right, from the outside. But for they themselves, who are maybe not aware of that, they're laughing out of ignorance, right? Maybe laughing at people they consider to be inferior to them, right? There's kind of no necessarily unmasking of the truth there for that person, right? Right. And we might say that, right, it's precisely at those moments where our supposed superiority vis-a-vis another group is unsure, that status needs to be reasserted, or that supposed status needs to be reasserted. So people reach for, right, certain forms of humor in order to kind of supposedly re-solidify their superiority, right? And then maybe it's precisely in that kind of, right, inner working of that humor that there's that kind of ambiguity that's revealed, right? Because there's obviously still a kind of incongruity there, and it's working on a couple of levels, right? There's the perceived incongruity, right, of the laugher vis-a-vis the supposedly superior laugher vis-a-vis the supposedly inferior person who is the object of such laughter, right? But then there's also the kind of breaking away of the incongruity, right? That can come from a kind of realization that incongruity between the superior and the inferior is actually false, right? I'm thinking there's a great story by Ralph Ellison called An Extravagance of Laughter, where the whole thing is him going to like apologize for this extravagant bout of laughter that he had, right? And going to see the play Tobacco Road. Right. And he starts to think about these laughing barrels, right? This joke about these laughing barrels that were in the segregated South, whereas if a Black person felt a bout of laughter come on, right, they had to duck their head in a barrel and start, right, laugh into the barrel, right? Because whites were afraid, right, that the laughter, right, would be contagious and infect them too, right? And there's a kind of the laughing Black man is supposedly inferior, right? Because they can't control themselves and have to laugh. But that kind of failure to control themselves, right, from the standpoint of the white supremacist, right, needs to be controlled, right, precisely because it might infect us too. Right. So precisely in that kind of attempt to kind of use humor as a way to kind of control the humor, there's also the kind of danger that kind of humor spills out and has this equalizing effect. Right. So I agree with you at the end of the day, I guess is what I'm saying. I just kind of was thinking through, like, I'm always kind of that hard case of kind of thinking about like, well, what if, is there ambiguity in this case? And I think there is, right? It's just maybe operating at a couple of different levels. Yeah.
I know it might not be my turn, but I have one more example, if you allow me, of ambiguity and ambivalence related to the theme in which you're interested. You come from the social sciences. Have you ever wondered how humor can do opposite things? Like in martial arts, like with a whip, you can throw the butt of humor to the wall, and we can, with the whip, bring you closer. How is it possible that the same tool can bring two people so close and some people put them really near the wall? It's a paradoxical tool. And this is very important because we are human beings that live an impossible ambiguity and ambivalence in being social animals, social beings that need the cooperation, but still are very aggressive and cannot trust the other person at the moment that there would be some kind of anger or whatever between us. So humor, I think, here's the truth about the superiority thing. There's always superiority, but also humor unites. Humor is always a threesome. Two at least unite against a third. The third is not necessarily a person, it can be an idea. So this is why it relieves anxiety momentarily, and we are grateful for that, because you and me unite against an idea. So we have both. We have an aggressivity toward the idea or the third, and we have the closeness in which we appreciate that we can be not aggressive for some moment. We can leave the weapons at the door and unite. Unfortunately, as human beings, we always unite against. So if you have this complex tool, not of two, but of three, much things that are not clear in humor become clear. And this is an important ambivalence. We want freedom, we want to be independent, we have to cooperate. This cooperation has its limits. When we can be friendly, we are terribly grateful, but it always at an expense of something. If not a person, at least an idea. And this is our tragedy and the source of our comedy.
Great, thank you. Professor Lombardini, would you like to respond briefly?
Oh no, I'll just say thank you for I agree. I'll let Professor Moeller give his comments. Yeah.
Oh, great, thank you. Professor Moeller?
Yeah, thanks. Very, very good presentation and very good comments by Professor Amir. Just very briefly, I mean, again, like I think Professor Amir is saying two very important things. Number one, that's something that humor and I would say irony points out that there is truth and non-truth at the same time, and they're both equally strong, and there's no they're both there at the same time with the equal strength. And then the second thing, of course, and that this is the human condition. And then the second point was about at the end about overcoming or antidote against violence and aggression. And I think both points are very, very important, very well taken. And again, also the presentation by Professor Lombardini was pointing to a lot of the things we discussed earlier, but particularly about pedagogy. Just one minor footnote at the very end of Professor Lombardini's talk, he was mentioning which is a topic we didn't talk about yet, the connection between sexuality and humor and sexual vocabulary and so forth. I just have a simple question. I mean, there is particularly with regard to the sexual vocabulary, there is a strong connection between being humorous and laughter and swearing, swear words. Can you say a little bit about that connection, maybe? I would just be interested. It's just a question.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, I mean, from my take, I haven't thought a ton about this, but I do think that there is a kind of, right, if we go back to incongruity theories of humor, right? There's a kind of a certain set of social norms about what kinds of things can be said in what context, right? What kinds of things can be talked about, right? And I think like swearing is always funny, like when I'm from New Jersey and I'm an Italian American, and I don't know if that means one thing to anyone in this context, but it means that I swear a lot, and I tend to get angry very quickly. Now, my students don't necessarily know that about me, but when, for example, maybe 3 weeks into the semester, I'm on a rant on something, and I drop an F-bomb, right? They're all like giggling and whatever. Why, right? What is inherently funny about me saying this F-U-C-K word? word, right? There's nothing inherently funny about that word, but they don't expect me to say it, right? And so and it's not necessarily like it's transgressing a kind of norm, right? But it's doing so in a kind of playful enough way, right? Where, it's clear I'm not cursing at them, right? And so it's not like I'm not like abusing my power in some kind of way, right? In the same way, right, that happens also when, even if I'm doing things for like non-humorous purposes in class, like I remember trying to explain Greek pederasty to my students when I was talking about Pericles' funeral oration, right? And there were a bunch of them just giggling in the background, like schoolboys, right? I was like, oh my God, I can't believe he's talking about this. And I was like, yeah, we're going to talk about this because like there's this whole metaphor of the Erastes and the Eromenos. And if you want to understand what Pericles is doing, you need to understand this kind of social context. But just kind of bringing up that topic, right? That might not be the same. My students tend to be pretty socially conservative down in Virginia, right? And so the idea that like in a formal classroom, like someone would bring up those kinds of things, right, was just inherently funny to them, right? And so that would be my take. It's kind of the kind of has to do with our social expectations about what we're permitted or should be talking about in certain right contexts, right? But then again, right? Yeah, and I think that the comedies themselves kind of then you recreate that kind of context, right? Right. We would expect those kinds of things to be said in a comedy, but the way that those kinds of words or topics still have that powerful effect is they kind of recreate, right, among the audience, that kind of social expectation, right, that this shouldn't be said in this context, and then say it anyway, right?
Great, thank you. So I see Dr. Amir has a hand. We'll go to you next, but I just want to quickly say, thanks to everyone for your presentations and comments. We'll now go ahead and open the floor generally to questions and comments. So we'll start with Professor Amir. If anyone else has a comment or question, please just raise your hand or put it in the chat.
I wanted just to answer to what Professor Moeller asked about sexual humor. It's very interesting because if Freud would have been right after the sexual revolution, sexual humor should have disappeared or lessened, but it did not. What's interesting in sexual humor that it's aggressive. It's an example, most of it. It's very hard to find sexual jokes which are not aggressive. And so I think this is an example of the frustration that we have, of this ambivalence. We cannot read without, and we cannot without. We need adaptation, and we resent that deeply. Men resent women, men maybe resent sometimes sexuality itself, or the materiality of sexuality, or the difference between fantasy and reality. Yes? So this aggression towards sexuality to this day, ask any comedian that goes on stage. Aggressive humor works, which is quite interesting, and sexual humor in its aggressive form works as well.
Thank you. Yeah, makes sense.
Great, thanks. So again, open to comments or questions at this time. Okay, great. I see one from Lu Yao Li. Please go ahead.
Thanks for the great presentations. I have a question about Professor Moeller's presentation. Professor Moeller has mentioned about philosophical humor could address the moral fear to some extent, and I'm wondering, like, how does it? It's only for the normative moral theory, or it is for the moral theory in general. In other words, that, for example, in the Zhuangzi, that the humor provide some kind of special moral theories, or it is like totally give up the moral concern for Zhuangzi. Thank you.
Thank you for the question. Again, yes, I do think very briefly that the providing relief for moral fear is very important for the Zhuangzi, and that the Zhuangzi itself can be understood as a form of therapeutic philosophy addressing the moral fear that was present in the society when the book was written. So this moral fear was, yeah, of course, its own morality is always strongly normative. And in this context, it's like the normal pressure, normative and moral pressures related to social expectations regarding behavior in accordance with roles, right? That's, I think, whatever fame and your social status and so forth. These are like very important things in a strongly Confucian or pre-Confucian society, and I think Zhuangzi is strongly addressing that. Then is there still some kind of morality attached to it? I think that is kind of overrated. Of course, as I said earlier, just very briefly, contemporary interpretations, particularly from Anglo-American philosophers, try to, identify this or that moral position in the Zhuangzi. And again, I think that is kind of mistaken. I don't think the point of the Zhuangzi is to kind of replace a wrong morality with a right morality, but precisely instead of a more moralistic approach, to have this therapeutic approach. So I personally think that it is hermeneutically misguided to understand the critique of morality that is very obvious in the Zhuangzi, and that basically every interpreter also agrees and identifies. And I think but the point is not, again, to that the Zhuangzi wants to replace a wrong morality with a right morality, the wrong moral approach with a right moral approach. It wants precisely to dissolve the moralistic, let's say, attitude and kind of do some sort of conversion from a moralistically oriented approach to philosophy to a therapeutically approach to philosophy. So that's my basic understanding of the Zhuangzi, and that's why I don't think it's a very productive hermeneutic way to look for this or that moral position.
Thank you, Professor Moeller. I have a follow-up question about the first aspect of humor you mentioned about the superiority. Do you think, like in the Zhuangzi, there is a challenge to the superiorities by the humor, or in the for example, in the Zhuangzi, there is no such thing like superiorities, like people are no one are superior to other. So I mean, does the humor has to deal with superiorities, or just like I mean, does the addressing the superiority issue, is this necessary for humor?
Yes, I do think addressing superiority, as you said, is very important. And that was basically also expressed by both Professor Amir and Professor Lombardini. But of course, it's not in order to assert superiority, nor in order to deny the prevalence of superiority in society, but again, to show the incongruity and the ambiguity of superiority, to reverse the superiority, to show that the superior person or the superior whatever status is from another perspective the not superior, right? That's kind of, it's always this reversal, to show the ambiguity, the contingency of the superiority that is all pervasive in society. So yes, superiority is like a major theme in humor, but the point is not to assert the superiority, nor to kind of replace superiority with equality, but to show the contingency and ambiguity of the superiority mode, which we are, as Professor Amir said, is like an existential condition that we're all existing within. And again, the point is just to show the reversibility, the ambiguity, the ridiculousness of this superiority framework. That's the point.
Thank you, Professor.
Mm.
Great, thank you. Anyone else from the audience who'd like to chime in with a comment or question? I'll also invite our presenters to add any additional comments or questions you may have for each other.
I'd just like to say thanks again to both Professor Lombardini and Amir. I found both the contributions by both very, very valuable. Thank you.
Very heartedly echo the same sentiment.
Thank you very much, Professor Moeller. Your presentation was also very interesting, and John, it was great to meet you in person. And I was very touched and moved. Usually, I'm quite alone trying to tie the humor to the human condition. You know, people I work with, they prefer to work on jokes and comedians and analyze them and the ethics of joking. And I'm very happy. I set a book series not only on philosophy of humor, but on the philosophy of the human condition at will. If any one of you have a book in it or knows someone who would like to contribute to that, I would appreciate discussion on the human condition. I'm quite alone in that.
Thank you, Lydia.
Okay, I think if there are no more questions or comments, I'll go ahead and say thank you again to all of our presenters for a really illuminating roundtable discussion. Professor Amir, Moeller, and Lombardini. We'll thank you with a quick round of applause. And yeah, thanks to all our attendants. This recording will be posted on the 四海为学 website. And I hope to see everyone at forthcoming 四海为学 events. Great to meet you all and see you next time.